This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you are watching unfold did not begin with a vote or a speech or a crisis banner sliding across a screen. It began quietly, administratively, almost politely. A system adjusted itself without asking permission. And most people didn't notice because nothing appeared to be collapsing, but something fundamental shifted. Not power, not borders, something deeper. The rules that decide who controls stability and who is allowed to fail. The difference between choice and compliance. This isn't chaos, it's order. A new kind, one that doesn't announce itself and doesn't need public consent to operate. It only needs acceptance after the fact. If this feels familiar, it's because you're already inside it. And if you think this is about somewhere else, that assumption is exactly what keeps it invisible. Stay with me. This only makes sense once you see what's actually doing the controlling. For a long time, we were trained to believe control came from faces, from offices, from elections, from who won and who lost. That model no longer explains what's happening now, because the system isn't responding to personalities anymore. It's responding to pressure, to supply, to leverage, to a single variable that decides whether economies breathe or choke. What actually governs stability today is not law or diplomacy, or even force in the traditional sense. It's access. Who can turn the flow on? Who can shut it off? And who is forced to live with the consequences when it happens? This is why decisions that look foreign suddenly feel domestic. Why actions taken far away show up in grocery bills, border stress, and political panic at home. The system has collapsed distance. And once control is exercised this way, it doesn't need justification, only repetition. That's the shift most people missed. And once you see it, you start noticing where it was tested first. The most dangerous changes are the ones that arrive without drama. No emergency session, no declaration, just a gradual rewriting of what feels normal. Before, intervention required justification, debate, time. Now, intervention is framed as maintenance, as restoration, as something necessary to keep the system from stalling. The language softened while the reach expanded. Before, sovereignty was treated as a fixed condition. You had it or you didn't. Now, it behaves more like a performance review, conditional, temporary, revocable, based on outcomes, not consent. And the public adjusted. Because the effects were delayed, because the disruptions were packaged as solutions, because the pain showed up somewhere else first. This is how a long shift hides in plain sight. It doesn't feel like takeover, it feels like management. And once that idea settles in, it spreads quietly from one place to another, from exception to template, which is why the next moment matters. Because what looked like a single incident was actually a rehearsal. And rehearsals are never the point. They're preparation. Then the system stopped pretending it was abstract. Something happened that felt sudden, forceful, efficient. A move so direct it cut through months of speculation in a single moment. On the surface, it looked like enforcement, a corrective action, a response to failure. The language around it was calm, almost casual, as if this were simply how things were handled now. But the shock wasn't the action itself. It was the ease. How quickly control shifted hands. How little resistance appeared. How rapidly the outcome was treated as settled. This wasn't escalation. It was confirmation. Proof that the mechanism worked exactly as designed, that access could be seized, that revenue could be redirected, that consequences could be imposed without firing a traditional shot. And the reaction wasn't outrage, it was relief. Markets adjusted, prices moved, attention drifted, which should worry you. Because once a system learns it can do this cleanly, quietly, and without backlash, it doesn't stop. It looks for the next place it can be tested. Here's what actually made that moment possible. Not courage, not consensus, infrastructure. The system doesn't move by persuasion anymore. It moves by capture. You don't have to occupy territory if you can occupy the pipeline. You don't have to govern people if you can govern the flows they depend on. Revenue, energy, transport, insurance, access. Once those are controlled, everything else follows. Wages lag, prices adjust, governments scramble, and the cost doesn't land where the decision was made. It lands downstream on populations that didn't vote for it and can't reverse it. This is why the beneficiaries are almost invisible. They're insulated, distributed, operating through contracts and custodians and temporary arrangements. Responsibility dissolves as profits concentrate. And the damage? That's socialized, exported, explained away as necessary friction in a system that claims it's preventing something worse. That's the mechanism. Clean, repeatable, legally gray, but operationally decisive. Once you understand it, the earlier moments snap into focus. Why speed mattered, why resistance was minimal, why the outcome was treated as inevitable, and why the next phase wouldn't look like debate at all. It would look like acceleration. Then it sped up. Not with speeches, with movement. Assets shifted, routes changed, guards stood down, others moved in. What used to take months happened in days. What used to require explanation stopped needing one. There was no announcement that rules had changed, just evidence that they no longer applied the same way. Control appeared where it hadn't before. Resistance didn't escalate. It evaporated. Because once the flow is cut, choices collapse. Governments don't debate, they react. Populations don't organize, they absorb. And the system doesn't pause to check legitimacy, it checks efficiency. Each step made the next one easier, less controversial, less visible. A new normal built from repetition, not consent. And this is where the danger sharpens. Because acceleration doesn't look like chaos. It looks like competence, like things finally working. Until the pressure reaches a point it can't be redirected anymore. That's when the consequences stop traveling outward and start snapping back. Here's where this stops being theoretical, because the system doesn't experience the consequences. You do. You feel it when the cost of ordinary things becomes unpredictable, when stability starts requiring constant adjustment, when the margin you thought you had quietly disappears. Not all at once, just enough to keep you compensating. You're told this is temporary, external, necessary, that someone somewhere is preventing something worse. And maybe that's true, but notice what's missing. You were never part of the decision, only the outcome. This is how control becomes personal without ever naming you. You don't resist, you adapt, you recalibrate expectations downward and call it resilience. And if this feels familiar, it should. Because once a system learns it can pass costs directly onto people without explanation, it keeps doing it. If you want to understand how far this goes and who decides when it stops, stay with me, because the next stage doesn't stay contained. It spreads. What began as a contained adjustment doesn't stay contained for long. Systems like this never do. Once the mechanism proves it can travel, it starts moving across borders without friction, because flows don't respect flags. When access is rerouted in one place, pressure appears somewhere else. Markets rebalance, alliances recalibrate. States that thought they were observers discover their participants, whether they agreed to it or not. This is how local enforcement becomes global conditioning. Not through invasion, through dependency. Through the quiet realization that stability now comes with strings, and those strings can be pulled from far away. The ripple effect isn't loud. It's administrative. Insurance premiums shift. Shipping lanes thin. Governments start making decisions they call pragmatic because the alternative feels worse. And here's the unsettling part. No one has to announce that the rules have changed internationally. The behavior adjusts on its own. Fear does the coordinating, which means by the time the consequences are visible everywhere, the system is already locked in. And the question is no longer whether this spreads. It's how far. From here, the system has 3 directions it can take. None of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The flows remain controlled, but carefully. Pressure is managed. Prices stabilize just enough. States adapt to a world where access is conditional, not guaranteed. This path looks calm, technical, sustainable, until you notice how much autonomy quietly disappears in exchange for predictability. The second is erosion. Control continues, but unevenly. Some places absorb more pressure than others. Legitimacy thins. Trust degrades. Governments keep functioning, but only by explaining less and enforcing more. This path feels familiar because it moves slowly, too slowly to trigger alarms, until the institutions hollow out from the inside. The third is rupture, a moment when the system pushes too far, too fast, when a flow can't be rerouted, when a population stops absorbing, when enforcement meets refusal. This path doesn't announce itself in advance. It arrives as a shock that everyone later claims was obvious. What matters is this: the system doesn't choose consciously among these paths. It follows incentives, efficiency, momentum, and once acceleration begins, intent becomes irrelevant. Which is why what comes next isn't about prediction. It's about recognition. There is a temptation at this point to look for reassurance, for a villain, for a lever that can be pulled to reverse all of this cleanly. That temptation is part of the danger, because systems like this don't collapse when people are angry. They persist when people are relieved, when the lights stay on, when prices stabilize just enough, when the cost is spread thin enough that no single moment feels worth resisting. What you've seen isn't a crisis. It's a capability, one that can be used again, somewhere else, under a different justification, with the same quiet efficiency. And once that capability exists, the question is no longer who is in charge. It's what happens when control becomes the default solution to every instability. If you stop here, it's easy to believe this is as far as it goes, that this is the end state. It isn't. Because the next phase doesn't announce itself as policy. It shows up as necessity, as something done because there was no other choice. If you want to understand where this leads and what it demands from you next, don't look away now. Follow this forward. Question the mechanisms, not the headlines, because the system is still moving and it hasn't reached its limit yet.